Before I get into this video, I just want to give a shout out to Blue Bow who helped me gather official info for Call of Abyss and talk lore with me. And it's mostly my discussions with them that led me to finally want to start this project. Massive thanks to them. So, there's a ton of Essence storylines and such in Identity V, but we all know that there are only 3 central story universes: the main lore, Truth and Inference, and Call of Abyss. Truth and Inference and main lore have pretty fleshed out events in their stories for the most part, but Call of Abyss is structured basically like most other Essence lore stories. They have a few extra things like song lyrics and whatnot, but there is still barely anything perfectly expanded upon. This makes Call of Abyss one of the hardest storylines to get into, even though it has some pretty well-loved stories in it. Despite the fact it can seem complicated at first, it's really not that bad once you get into it. And trust me, it's definitely on the same level of quality as the other 2 big boys, with some wacky theory material to go along with it. But that's gonna come later. Right now all I'm gonna do is explain the storylines of Call of Abyss from the 1st to the 5th, and show what all the little details mean. So let's go ahead and get into our first event, the pirate shenanigans. I'm not sure if it's because this was the first story, or that it was made pretty early on in the game's life, but the first Call of Abyss story doesn't really feel like it has much going on in comparison to the other entries. KOA 1 is believed to take place somewhere between the mid-1600s and early 1700s, in a time where pirates were quite abundant. The life of a pirate was already difficult and dangerous enough, but there was one spot in the ocean that was the most dangerous: the dreaded Abyss. The Abyss was the home claimed by many peculiar creatures that came from its depths, which made it nearly impossible for most sailors to get close. Nevertheless, pirates couldn't help but want to explore the depths of the Abyss. One of these pirate crews happens upon the lost city of Rulia. This is a city from Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu, and is the city in which Cthulhu sleeps. The central plot is supposed to be about this pirate crew's adventure as they try to collect some of the many abyssal treasures while also surviving the dangers of the abyss itself. There's also a lot of background characters and side plots, the most important of which being the one between the caged butterfly and the pirate captain. The caged butterfly was a fan of romantic literature, and in particular was drawn to the short story Madame Butterfly, which both her skins are named after in some way. We'll get back to that in just a moment though. But basically, she just wants true love, and the pirate captain ends up falling for her. The captain wanted to get a treasure just for her, that being the sea snail, which could give someone an eternally youthful appearance and was supposedly the only thing with the ability to resurrect someone. This singular piece of treasure became the captain's driving desire for exploring the abyss, and all his other crew mates, who were mostly working together to find treasure for a shared profit, didn't like that very much. It wasn't that they thought the captain was keeping the sea snail away from them, but his search for it was a hindrance to their main goal. Yet considering that he was their only captain, they had to compromise for the sake of cooperation. But the longer their adventure went on, the more frustrated the crew got with their captain's love obsession getting in their way. Some considered throwing Caged Butterfly into the ocean, and for a while they didn't act on that thought. Maybe the abyss was getting so dangerous that having to deal with the captain's distractions was becoming a threat to their lives, or maybe they were just fed up. Either way, the crew does eventually decide to throw Caged Butterfly overboard later on, to snap their captain out of his trance with her, and it seems to possibly work. With nothing more to be important to him, the captain tries to forget about the Caged Butterfly. As for Caged Butterfly herself, after she gets thrown overboard, she is pulled by a current towards an oceanic volcano, and gets trapped within the coral that merges with her. She seems to wake back up there, but we are told that her heart sank into the depths. I'm not entirely sure what this means, since beforehand it seems like everyone was aware that her heart was a treasure. So I guess that just means she wasn't just some normal person. Or maybe it had something to do with the sea snail effect on her if the captain already got it, but I'm not sure, and I don't think that really matters. Even without her heart she apparently lives, which also probably doesn't matter, but is quite peculiar. The only thing I can think of is that she merged with the coral because it's abyssal coral, and the abyss does funky stuff with people. Anyways, so about that short story, the Madame Butterfly. It's nothing major to be honest, but there's some things I want to point out anyway. The short story is about a Japanese geisha named Cho-Cho-san, who prepares to marry a man named Pinkerton, a Navy officer from the US. Pinkerton only wanted to marry her for his own convenience, until he found a wife he would actually want in America. Some time after the marriage, Pinkerton had to leave Japan. He is gone for a while, but Cho-Cho patiently waits for his return, believing their love to be real. Eventually, People close to her begin to doubt that Pinkerton would return, and try to tell her to move on to someone else, but she persists. No matter who tries to convince her, she doesn't listen to any of them. She gets news that Pinkerton is coming back, and eagerly waits to surprise him when he returns. However, the only reason he came back was because he found out that she had given birth to his son, so he hesitantly returned to get him. When he doesn't show up, where she's waiting at, Cho-Cho visits the nearby American consul, to ask about contacting Pinkerton. Then, a blonde American woman comes in to ask the consul to send Pinkerton a telegram, where she mentions their plans to get the baby, and to speak with his mother, Cho-Cho, who was busy away from home waiting for Pinkerton's arrival. This woman was, of course, Pinkerton's new wife. It all finally hits Cho-Cho, and she returns home. She says goodbye to her close friend and maid Suzuki, and her child, then goes to her room to take her own life with a self-inflicted stab. The first stab is not fatal, and she is unsure if she wants to go all out. But then, Suzuki comes in with the baby, making him cry. Cho-Cho drops the sword she had and lets Suzuki fix up her wound. The story ends with Pinkerton's wife visiting the home again, finding nobody there. If you look up the story of Madame Butterfly, you may see some information that says Cho-Cho-san does kill herself in the end, but I believe that's just in adaptations like the opera, and Koa mentions the short story specifically, in which she lives. I know I went on a little with that bit, but it is the biggest piece of characterization we have for Caged Butterfly. So anyways, Cho-Cho is named Madame Butterfly because that's what her first name translates to in English. The butterfly symbolized how fragile she was, and how Pinkerton mistreated her with promises of false love. In Koa, we have two skins based on the name of the story for the same character, Caged Butterfly, and Madame Coral. Caged Butterfly is calling back to the themes of fragility and being taken advantage of. It's probably got to do with the crew's disdain with the captain's obsession over her, that resulted in them getting rid of her for their own gain. And the title of Madame Coral, just think of it as some kind of formal title, like Lady of the Coral or something like that, since she was trapped in and became one with it. At least I think that's what they're getting at. So anyways, outside of all that, there isn't too much of importance that happens in Koa 1. And despite the fact that the Caged Butterfly's story seems to take up so much of the story's character plots, it doesn't seem like the story itself found her very important. She isn't even in any of the posters, even though the two skins of Koa 1 were based on her story. The rest of it is just vague stuff about how the crew searches in the abyss, and finds a variety of treasures. They don't even go into anything deeper than that about their future conflicts, either. Koa 1 was the only Koa where their poster didn't even show an active conflict. If you ask me, I think it's because this first event is more like a prologue to the rest of the series, setting up things like the corruption of the abyss, the lost city, and all that sort of stuff, which will become more important to future events. So there really isn't much else to speak of here. Although, there's something about the Madam story with the captain that feels somewhat odd to me. Oh well, I'm sure it's nothing. Anyways, after the end of piracy's golden age, the crew's abyssal treasures are found by a company with no name, that we come to later call the Transportation Giant. We know little about them for now, but we'll just have to wait and see what comes next in the second Call of Abyss event. Call of Abyss 2 begins an unknown amount of time after the first, in a place called Steam City. This city is built from the city of Rulia and is where the crew of the first event sealed the Eye of the Abyss, which they collected in the Lost City. The Eye holds great power, and it also has the ability to make people around it go mad, or maybe even deform them like what has been seen before. The Eye's power is kept at bay in the extreme coldness of Steam City, but when the city's main source of power for keeping everything warm begins to run out of use, the people all freak out. They split into two groups, one who seeks to keep the Eye from being unleashed and find a new power source, and the other who wants to use the Eye to save and power the city. This one revolves mostly around the Steam Team, on the side of keeping the Eye sealed, and the evil Eye host, who wants to unleash it. The Steam Team began as the Spring Hand, a young boy who relied on his own handmade spring gear, which was nowhere near as efficient as the professional steam gear. The Spring Hand had big aspirations to join the ranks of the expedition. The expedition isn't really expanded on much in terms of what its purpose is, but it seems like it was an official city group that existed to seek out means of keeping the city warm. Based on all the descriptions from members of the expedition, they were definitely against turning to the Eye as a source of power. It appears, however, that their method wouldn't be enough to keep the city going forever, and as stated a moment ago, many people wanted to turn to the Eye to power the city. The expedition continued to refuse, clinging onto the chances of finding a better alternative, since the eye being unleashed and turning everyone mad wouldn't be any better than having to face the cold. But there was one man in particular who could no longer trust the methods of the expedition, and that was the Evil Eye host, also referred to as the traitor. This traitor was fully aware of what would happen if he unsealed the eye, but to him, the expedition's plan was foolish and equivalent to rolling over and allowing the cold to kill them all, which made plunging the city into the madness of the abyss seem preferable. But he couldn't do it on his own. Even if he got the eye, he wouldn't be able to keep it for long on his own. So he decides to turn to the Iron Hats. The Iron Hats were a group of the most desperate people in Steam City. They had nowhere else to go, so they had to make sure Steam City wouldn't become too frozen over to live in. And they too saw no other option than to use the eye, which led to them being approached by the traitor. A meeting was arranged to be had between the traitor and an odd man from the Iron Hats called the Punk. It appears the meeting was going all according to plan at first, but then the Spring Hand accidentally stumbled into finding them out when trying to use his faulty spring gear. In fear of being exposed, the Punk chases after the Spring Hand, but it was already too late. The expedition found the Punk going on a rampage after the Spring Hand, and Soundwave stepped in to fend him off. After being rescued, the expedition seemed to have noticed potential in the Spring Hand. He was taken in by them and was given proper steam equipment by the inventor, which is when the Spring Hand became the Steam Teen. It's unclear if he was trained under them for a while, or if it was all short term, because some time after, the traitor broke into the tower where the eye was being held, and stole it. However, it is unclear if this was a part of the original plan, or if they had to go straight to stealing it because of them getting exposed by the Spring Hand. Either way, this sent the expedition to war with the Iron Hats, both sides doing their best to keep the eye out of the other's clutches. We don't see much of this fight, but by the looks of the trailer, it ended with the traitor, now the Evil Eye host, dropping the eye and racing to grab it back against the Steam Teen and the rest of the expedition. And in the end, it's the Steam Teen who finally ends up with it. Despite the fact he seems adamant to keep the eye from being used, he is faced with the dilemma of choosing between safety and the chaos, or the risks of foolish hope. It isn't clear what really happens in the end, but it doesn't seem like it was anything good, because after whatever happens to them, the eye is found by the auctioneer in the frozen ruins of the city, and the plot of the third event is set into motion. Koa 3 is a bit of a fan favorite among many, and it's honestly one of my favorites as well. I also hate it because its weird plot structure leaves out way more necessary information in a few major spots that make it hard to tell what's going on. It's probably the main reason why I was turned off by Koa after I started getting into lore. Nothing made any sense, and they kept introducing a bunch of stuff that made it all even more complicated to the point where I just gave up on caring. The story mostly revolves around two things: Whiplash's part of the story with Puppeteer, and a few aspects of the Eye and the Abyss with the Netherwalker. I'll be getting back to this point momentarily after I explain everything we know. So as I mentioned earlier, the Eye is found in the ruins of Steam City by some kind of expedition group, however it's likely not any of the major groups were involved. It then ends up with the auctioneer, who hands it off to an artist named Pikmin. When Pikmin gets the Eye, it's shut, implying that the people in Steam City managed to seal it somehow, I guess. But the Eye soon opens for him seemingly out of the blue. That isn't expanded on much, but I think maybe it's awakened by Pikmin's desires. Either way, I don't think it matters too much. Once the Eye is opened, he is able to enter the Nether, which is basically just what admirers of the Abyss call the Abyss. Rather than be afraid of the Nether, Pikmin finds great inspiration in the crude art of the environment. As we already know, pretty much anything with abyssal energy can be bad news, and that includes anything and everything that can be found in the Abyss itself. Yet still, Pikmin wanted to take advantage of this, so he instead decided to create copies of the things he saw, and bring them back from the Nether. But even these copies carried abyssal energy with them, spreading it into the art gallery where his works were kept. He also at one point decides to abandon his human form to become the Netherwalker, although I'm not sure if that's something he did at the start of all this or later on. Accompanying him is his model, a dancer titled Vile Blossom. Vile Blossom is described to have a disfigurement of some kind, which I'm assuming is in reference to the erosion effect and not something she already had before, but based on the way it's explained and the fact she looks pretty normal otherwise. At first she's kind of bummed about getting screwed with by the Nether, but she comes to change her mind because of her book that taught her to not try and avoid the inevitability of losing perceived beauty, but accept the decay of time to maintain your own true self. Eventually it seemed her erosion was beginning to reach a pretty extreme degree, and since it apparently could only be transferred instead of simply being diminished, Pickman took her erosion upon himself. I think it's because he found more beauty in the pure human form, which is why he was so interested in her as a model in the Nether to start with. But after doing this, he acts like he has to find a replacement, as if by doing that he was then either unable to or was uninterested in using her as his model. So that doesn't make a lot of sense right now. I do have a possible explanation, but I'll save it for later since we need to get past the ending first. Anyhow, it seems Pickman was able to show his collection off to the auctioneer at some point, who was surprised by how good his copies were and decided to help spread his work so they can allow everyone to admire the Abyss. And I guess that's when the Investigation Bureau gets involved, which is an organization based mostly or only around abyssal-related cases. They caught on to the spread of the artwork, which was carrying the abyssal effects out into the world, and they needed to track it to the source to shut it all down. And we already know about the main cast that gets sent in from the Investigation Bureau, but they weren't the first. There was also Patchwork, who is the only other person from the Investigation Bureau aside from the main four who shows up to the museum. And he also wears the symbol of the Bureau on a Fear Officer badge, which is likely a specific division of the Bureau focusing on the Abyss. It appears that the Bureau sent Patchwork in solo to investigate the Netherwalkers Museum. We don't know much about what happened when he entered, but in the end he was perceived as a traitor by himself or the Investigation Bureau, who would seek to destroy him for being disabled or wounded for whatever reason. Based on the basic things we know, my best guess is that the abyssal madness drew him into an obsession, maybe sorta like Pickman was. Perhaps he was considering taking something valuable from inside the Abyss because of the madness, which would obviously not be allowed by the Bureau. When trying to do this, I think he is attacked by an abyssal entity, and gets a bad wound from it. These wounds are supposedly impossible to heal, just like it was impossible for Vile Blossom to eliminate her infection. Considering the dangers of having abyssal contents exposed to the outside world, maybe the part about the disabled and wounded being eliminated was just normal protocol for those with abyss infections instead of it having anything to do with Patchwork being a traitor. This was likely something everyone in the Bureau knew, and so he's probably still stuck in the Abyss, knowing he can't leave. He tries to patch up his wounds to prevent more abyssal entities from infecting it, but it likely didn't help too much. After that Fear Officer goes missing, the Bureau sends in a team consisting of the Trickster, Surveyor, Whiplash, and Puppeteer. Whiplash seems like the veteran of the team, Trickster and Surveyor are just normal professional members I guess, and oddly enough, the Puppeteer is just a newcomer to the Bureau, making it odd for her to be sent on such a mission. She's also the only woman of the group, and is quite young on top of that. Whiplash and Puppeteer are always shown together, since Whiplash was in charge of training Puppeteer during their time in the museum. Speaking of, there's not a lot that we see from the start of their mission to the point where they finally catch up to the Netherwalker. There are a few random statements alluding to things involving the Surveyor and Trickster, but for some reason those two are barely ever shown in anything, which is the most major contributor to the story's flaws since they act like their lore hold answers to certain things regarding the Puppeteer, without actually giving any clues to it. According to skin descriptions, the Surveyor slowly begins to succumb to the effects of abyssal madness, and the Trickster tries to protect him from it as long as he can. But during the short moment the two appear in the cinematic, he seemed pretty fine, and if he just suddenly lost control, I feel like that'd be something worth putting in the rest of the video. But they didn't, so I dunno, maybe they were there but just weren't as important to the rest of the scene compared to Whiplash and Puppeteer. And the whole thing about Trickster protecting Surveyor may just pertain to the other seemingly random part at the end of Trickster's description, about some kind of playful miscommunication that ends up taking its toll on the Puppeteer. And the only thing that really comes to mind for me is the heart of the machine Trickster made for Puppeteer. But I'm not sure what that has to do with anything because it never does anything unexpected. But moving on now, my explanation for that main video cinematic for Koa 3 might get a little weird for some newcomers to this sort of stuff, but you'll just need to bear with me. And I'll go ahead and try to explain the end fight itself first. So the team all enter the room where the Netherwalker is waiting for them, and they immediately begin their battle. The Netherwalker goes right for a swing at Whiplash, who jumps over his attack and lands behind him. Puppeteer quickly sends her bot over to help Whiplash, realizing he may not get to move out of the way before the Netherwalker takes another swing at him. The Netherwalker hits the bot, but instead of going for a sweeping motion like he did a moment prior, he does a vertical slash immediately which throws the bot backwards into Whiplash and stunning him for a moment, as if he was planning for the Puppeteer to make such a move. Now this next part has the more important stuff. Let's roll the clip here, and pay attention to how each of the compositions of the normal attacks and dodges with Whiplash in comparison to when Puppeteer's bot steps in for Whiplash. In the sequence, they use one shot for the Netherwalker's first swing, then the second for Whiplash's mid-air flip and then third for his landing and Puppeteer's reaction with her bot. But notice how the next few shots after they go out of sequence for a moment? The next shot shows the bot getting hit and thrown backwards into Whiplash, then the next shows when the bot was first jumping in front of Whiplash, then the shot zooms in on that. And the next shot is back to the bot getting hit again, just mirrored now. The animators are trying to show us that the Netherwalker was more than prepared for what the bot was going to do even though it seemed like Whiplash, the bigger offensive threat, was his main target. But he wasn't. Look at the quick and sudden shift of movement and lighting when we cut to the next shot. The Netherwalker swung his weapon back around immediately at Puppeteer instead of going for Whiplash when he was most vulnerable. And we don't even see his swing until he's already facing her, showing us that this was a very unexpected and well-planned move from the Netherwalker. This other vertical swing of his knocks the Puppeteer backwards, and off of a ledge. And a second into the shot, as we realize what was really going on, the face of Vile Blossom appears from behind, looking over them all as they are shown figuratively fighting on her music box. And right as her face appears, the tentacles begin to move as well, as if on cue. We then cut between the Puppeteer and her bot falling in similar positions, and we see her controller hit the ground, specifically on the side with this power core thing or whatever this is, implying the bot was now unable to move or anything. Then we cut to a bunch of small tentacles coming up and grabbing the Puppeteer's face while she just sits there with no reaction. However, immediately after that we get a shot of a single large tentacle coming up and pulling down the Puppeteer, with Whiplash in the background. Then we cut facing down, where we can see her fall down into Cthulhu's big lady hole or mouth or whatever, and you can even see his little eyes in here. Right after that, we cut over to Puppeteer again, just floating in some blue void. We see tentacles push out her left eye, then that's it really. Okay, so, first things first, the basics of the ending are pretty simple. They're just trying to show us that it was Vile Blossom who was in control of the whole thing. And I don't even have to further prove that because the animators literally gave an official explanation about how that was their direction for the scene. But besides that, what about the actually weird thing that came after? You know, the last shots of Puppeteer in seemingly two different situations? I was looking at this one for a while, because something about it was just clearly off. Then, when I found it, I thought I was going crazy or something, but I wasn't. I was just stupid. You see this shot of Puppeteer? Well, yeah, it's not the Puppeteer. Not that one though, that one's real. I mean the one with all the small tentacles in the empty void. It should be enough to suggest so based on the fact that they want to make it very clear these two circumstances couldn't be happening on the same side of the platform. I'm not exactly sure how, but it's the only possible explanation. It's probably got something to do with all that vague stuff from the trickster. So, when the controller breaks, the disguise activates automatically, I assume. When we see the controller break, the eye of the abyssal creature glows for a moment before it hits the ground. And also, since that would make it totally immobile, it would explain the lack of response. Even though most of that whole animation used still models and no facial expression. The other half of the scene with Puppeteer getting pulled down towards Cthulhu does at least have some movement in both of its shots. And it should be even more obvious since they don't move at all after the tentacles are somehow able to easily push out through their eye. Which wouldn't make much sense unless there was a hollow area inside. So what's the point of this exactly? And why would they show it at all? Well, I don't know. Again, so much of this seems to hinge on us understanding the stuff with Trickster and Surveyor, and without the needed expansion on them, we're left with nothing but baseless conspiracies. But, I'm thinking maybe it was getting possessed by an entity from in the abyss, like we saw with the porcelain doll. I can't expand much on that idea though. Also, the video in general appears to be singing the song from the perspective of Whiplash to himself and also to Puppeteer, and the whole video itself is based mostly around their dynamic. But I think it goes a lot deeper than just the lines of the song. I'm sure you've already noticed the strong use of red and blue, as well as lightness and darkness throughout that video. At first it appears that it's just meant to be about good confronting evil, and there's a lot of easy shots to point to for that argument, but I think it's a bit more specific than that. Near the start, we see this purple eye in the middle of a red abyssal flower. The inside of the eye is overcome by tentacles, as a corrupt redness begins to grow around it. This makes me believe that it's all meant to be based on the theme of beauty versus corruption, which comes up explicitly in Vile Blossom's story, which I spoke a bit about earlier. For instance, in this scene early on, there is a shot where the set is split between blue and red. Puppeteer stands on the blue side behind Whiplash, and Whiplash stands on the line in between. This is not only a reflection of their teacher and student dynamic, but also more specifically the idea that Whiplash, who is a trained veteran when it comes to the abyss, is trying to protect the Puppeteer, who is new to it all, from the effects of abyssal madness and erosion that may threaten them on their mission. He wants to keep her humanity pure from its corruption. During the video, the shot with those two is immediately followed up with the shot of the eye and the flower. So they're probably trying to re-establish the themes of beauty and corruption for the rest of the video. But I also think it's meant to establish the personal perspectives each character has towards those concepts. Like I mentioned, the first shows Whiplash trying to keep Puppeteer away from the corruption, but in the next, we see the Netherwalker watching full corruption unfold. Since he was someone who had already willfully allowed himself to be overcome by the effects of corruption. And one more thing before I continue. In that split side scene with Whiplash, he has both colors shine on him since he stands in the middle. And later on in the video, when Whiplash and Puppeteer take out their gear as they're about to fight the Netherwalker, we get one shot on them both individually. And there is a visible difference in the blue and red color ratio between them. Puppeteer's shot is brighter and uses mostly blue, while Whiplash's shot isn't as consistently bright, and uses more red in comparison. This could be a coincidence, but considering the previous color duality already associated with Whiplash, it could further point to the idea being driven home that Whiplash has a history of being involved with work related to the abyss. And over time has had slight corruptions affect his mind that he has trained himself to control. This may also involve the way he talks about maintaining peace of mind to Puppeteer, as a way of avoiding leaning too far into the madness caused by the abyss. Anyways, that's just a side note, let's move on. So right before the encounter, we see very strong usage of not just color contrast, but also contrast of light and dark. Puppeteer and Whiplash have a foggy blue light on their side, and the Netherwalker has a dark red fog on his. We also see that the Netherwalker is standing inside of the red fog, while Puppeteer and Whiplash are growing distant from the blue fog and light in the background as they approach the Netherwalker, symbolizing them needing to dive into the heart of the corruption. And this is further shown after the fight begins, where the entire battlefield is surrounded by the red fog, and all the characters cast heavy and dark shadows. After Puppeteer gets knocked down, the shot of the disguised bot is surrounded by a red void as it gets corrupted by the abyssal tentacles, and the real Puppeteer is falling into the mouth of Cthulhu. But this feels a bit strange, doesn't it? I mean, isn't the red supposed to represent the corruption of the abyss? So shouldn't Cthulhu, the literal center of the corruption, use similar colors? Well, remember, the whole theme of beauty and corruption stemmed from Vile Blossom's story. The book she wears on her, titled Flowers of Evil, is explicitly mentioned as the book that inspired her beliefs on her changing beliefs about beauty after being put under the physical erosion of the abyss. And in the official explanations for her design, the book is described as having this purple eye and tentacles on it for the purpose of expressing the concept of equally combining beauty and corruption, which is at the heart of Vile Blossom's story. That's also why it's purple, because it's a combination of the colors blue and red. Based on that, the best thing I can come up with is that Cthulhu's purple color represents not only the core corruption of the abyss, but also maybe the results of trying to dig too deep into understanding it, which is something that is in people's natural instinct. Although it could very well be a coincidence since most major entities have similar cosmic style colors. That's just a thought based on the heavy attention to color. There's also that other whole thing about what happened to the Vile Blossom that made her into the supposed villain, why she had to be replaced, and why they wanted to target Puppeteer so badly in particular. The entire situation with Vile Blossom is just weird and vague, but I think that some time after having the erosion transferred to the Netherwalker, she was somehow taken over by the abyss. Specifically how this happened, and if it had anything to do with the energy transfer to the Netherwalker is unknown. But I think one of the biggest things involved with this whole plan was the sculptures from the abyss. As we see in the video, the Vile Blossom sculpture gets filled with the corruptive tentacles, just like we see happen to the disguised bot, and for some reason they end up breaking out of it. Also, let's not forget about the porcelain doll. The doll was made in the abyss by the Netherwalker, and contained a soul or entity that also came from the abyss. This skin also came with an accessory along with it, the Edelweiss, although I'm not completely certain if it's connected to the porcelain doll specifically, because the description specified the title of geisha. The Edelweiss came from the Snow Kingdom, and even though we don't get told much about it in-game, the Edelweiss flower is well known for being able to withstand harsh conditions. Possibly referring to how the abyssal entity was able to make it outside with the doll. Also, the porcelain doll's design uses primarily blue and light colors, so make of that what you will. The other accessory based on a flower that was said to come from the Snow Kingdom was the Snow Lotus, which is the dancer's accessory. And this time, we know it's likely they really meant Vile Blossom, because she is specified to be a dancer and model in Koa, and this aspect comes up in little ways sometimes in the videos. This one's description actually points out the fact that the flower was supposed to only have the ability to grow in the Holy Land of the Snow Kingdom. Yet for some reason it goes on just fine when the dancer gets it, and it continues to bloom. In real life, the white lotus symbolizes purity of the mind, and a perfected spirit. This would line up with the unique mindset the Vile Blossom formed after being physically corrupted that was based on her book, about needing to accept what happened to her as natural. The Snow Lotus is also known for the fact that every day, it will lose its old blooms and add on new ones. For this reason, it commonly symbolizes rebirth. And this may just be a reference to how the abyssal erosion changed Vile Blossom instead of having anything to do with being involved in the possession. But it's quite strange how both these two characters and only these two characters are the ones associated with flowers from the Snow Kingdom which both have something to do with the strange ways those flowers survive abnormal conditions. What's also strange is the fact that all the characters suspected of being possessed like the doll and Vile Blossom, or being planned by someone to get possessed like Puppeteer, all involve young women, and based on the few things we have, all I can assume is that it's related to purity and our societal ideas of beauty, for some reason. Which is also why I think they wanted to target the Puppeteer specifically. She was the only one specified to be a newcomer, and she just so happens to be the only female from the investigation bureau we know of that's ventured into the museum. And her importance over the others may lie in the fact that her bot can make a perfect replica of her appearance somehow. Meaning whatever entity is wishing to control her can do so with the machine and make it out into the world. But it's mostly speculation here, since we aren't given much info on these things. Now, one last thing. So the ending to that one video cinematic depicting the battle with the Netherwalker might not actually be the end. In official information on Koa 3, when the devs talk about Whiplash watching Puppeteer fall, they describe the situation as creating a dilemma for Whiplash to save Puppeteer. At first I was a bit confused, unsure if they meant he'd save her and take her place or something, but I think I might see it now. In another Koa 3 cinematic that came out after the other one, we see Whiplash and Puppeteer running through this building we assume is the museum. But they start hearing whispers, and it's clearly something that wasn't normal before for them. Shapes of light suddenly shine on a nearby statue, making some kind of face with what looks like a question mark on the chest. The light shining in from the windows is also moving in an unusual way that shouldn't be possible in any normal environment. While trying to understand their environment, a light suddenly flashes on behind them, and they go to approach it, finding a miniature sculpture of the vile blossom spinning on a music box before it stutters up when turning forward. As if on cue again, the other larger statues around them begin to move and turn, and the two realize that something else shows up on the opposite end of the hall. This one has a noticeable red glow behind it that wasn't there on the other side. They approach it, then Puppeteer presses her hand against the glass and a sculpture of herself jolts forward in her exact position against the glass, like it's trying to copy what she's doing. Puppeteer jumps back, and Whiplash instantly places a hand on her shoulder to keep her calm before he even looks at the sculpture himself. The sculpture then starts to make odd jerking motions back and forth just like the other statue. Then suddenly, just out of nowhere, Whiplash starts getting some kind of flashback to when Puppeteer had fallen into the hole with Cthulhu, showing both of the different shots. And then it flashes up the sculpture of the vile blossom and the statue with the shapes of light, two things which they just saw, and he starts to focus progressively more on the glass case before smashing it open with his weapon. Tentacles then start crawling out of something from the inside and attack the camera, seeming to set off yet another battle. So what I'm guessing happened here was that when Puppeteer fell into whatever that was in Cthulhu's mouth, Whiplash dove in after her and the two then found themselves inside the abyss, or a specific part of it. It's very clear based on the shifting lighting alone that whatever this place is that there it isn't anything natural. And based on the way Whiplash reacts to Puppeteer's sculpture implies that this took place after the other video. So if we go by that assumption, the sculpture with the lights flashing does look pretty similar to the Netherwalker's face, and that question mark would be a way of mocking Whiplash for foolishly diving in with Puppeteer. To him, there was no way to really save her, and when he jumped in all it meant was that they were both doomed, at least in his eyes. It appeared that the vile blossom statue was activated after the duo entered the visible range of it, and we know for sure that the second sculpture never activated until after Puppeteer got close and touched the glass, so it was likely a part of something planned out. I don't think the two statues juddering in the same direction as each other was a coincidence either. I'm not sure what exactly would have happened if they waited too long, but we can assume it has something to do with possessing Puppeteer. She was supposed to get trapped in this place alone, where she'd be unable to defend herself since she was relying on Whiplash beforehand while she was learning the ropes. They didn't plan for Whiplash to be so foolish as to dive in with her since there was no sense in expecting to save her from that, but the bond he built with her was too strong for him to let her die like that. So now that Whiplash is there, she has a real chance. And when Whiplash goes through the flashbacks of Puppeteer's fall, the juddering sculpture of the vile dancer, and the statue with the Netherwalker's mockery, in combination with the sudden activation of the Puppeteer statue in front of him, he is finally realizing what's really going on, and his expression goes from alert confusion to determination and understanding. He realizes they were going to take advantage of his vulnerable student that he's come to care about, and now, with that knowledge, he's ready to keep her safe from whatever comes next to get her out alive. And I think that's it for Koa 3, because it doesn't look like we get official confirmation on what happens after that moment. You're probably looking at all that and thinking it's pretty cool and all, and it totally is. But the one thing holding it back was that narrative structure, especially since they never took advantage of the cinematics to convey the lore for Surveyor and Trickster even a little bit, who are treated with so much importance and get little focus on their mysteries. Every other character was very well handled, especially ones like Patchwork that make you ask questions without making you feel totally lost. Well anyways, I think I've spent far too much time on this event already. Let's move on. Koa 4 is pretty great. In all aspects, you can definitely tell they were getting in the groove of this new direction for the series. They didn't have to do much to fix the issues of the previous story, but they still did pretty good. This is also the event where we are finally introduced to the three corporate giants, who have been working behind the scenes of the past events for a long time. These three corporations are based around research involving certain concepts that originated from the last three stories. They hold underground races in a place called the Dreamlands, which is from the Cthulhu mythos and is only accessible through dreams. I don't think there's anything people can do to get their chance to see Dreamland, but since we know that the corporations are only able to access it because of cooperation with the broadcaster who owns the Dreamlands, entry to it is likely something that is controlled by her. People can spend extensive amounts of time in the Dreamlands with very little time passing in their world as they sleep. Thousands of years can be spent there before someone even experiences half of a lifetime in the waking world. But let's move on to those corporate giants. First, there's the transportation giant, which I made a small mention of already. 100 or so years after Koa 1, they began researching the way some pirates combined abyssal materials with their ships. They organize the event and provide vehicles to be used in the races, and also study the results of their combinations of abyssal substances and machinery. Second is the energy giant. After the assumed fall of Steam City in Koa 2, they began doing research on the use of abyssal substances that the people from that city use to make energy. They supply the means of abyssal energy for their vehicles, and study the results. And third is the pharmaceutical giant. They study the combination of abyssal substances on people, and also work on statue activation and manipulation, which is apparently based on the invention techniques of Puppeteer and the Netherwalker, which isn't further specified. They transform participants by taking advantage of similar techniques, and study those results. The Investigation Bureau may also be involved in some areas, but it seems more like they work externally with specific corporations. We aren't told all that much about the history of the Great Race, so it could have been there for a while or it could be recently started. However, even though the game describes it as just an underground competition used for research, they also make it seem like the three giants are using it to compete against each other as well. The winner of the 24-hour race is rewarded with a powerful life force, and the corporation they work for will receive a huge benefit of some kind. Also, in the official event summary for Koa 4, we get this pretty random line saying what matters between the start and the finish line is the speed beyond the shadow out of time, with the shadow out of time in quotes. This will be kinda important later, but not that much. Anyhow, we don't need to linger on the background information for too long. As established, the corporations are using the race to test the effectiveness of using abyssal energy with their products. One of these was a sculpture made by the pharmaceutical giant with the Investigation Bureau based on those techniques first used by Pikmin and the Puppeteer. They made their creation participate in the race, but after winning, it devoured the powerful life force it received as the prize and continued to race, but started getting violent with the other racers. On top of that, the riders who fell victim to him would have their life force drained and age rapidly, but only if they leave Dreamland. And if they beat the thing, which they now call the Molten Hound, then they won't be affected. It is unclear how many people there were once this whole problem started, but now there are only a few racers left. There's Fueling Agent from the Energy Giant, Highway Cavalier who once worked for the Transportation Giant, Pumping Tires from the Transportation Giant, and Reflective Mirror from the Pharmaceutical Giant. There's also the Repairman, who raced for the Energy Giant, but either the racers or higher-ups made him work repairs since he lost his will to race. For now, we'll just focus on the story of these main racers. There isn't a lot of focus put on most of these racers' pasts and all that, but we do get some good information about Highway Cavalier. He once worked for the Transportation Giant, but I assume he quit doing anything for them after the Molten Hound began his rampage. He considers himself the last true racer, whatever that means, and he races with the simplest sportsmanship. I think that they meant the bare-bones level of sportsmanship, as in he avoids helping other racers in any way, but at the same time doesn't go out of his way to sabotage anyone. But after he suffers endless painful losses to the Molten Hound, he begins to change from his uncaring past. Highway Cavalier drives a busted-up 1923 Austin 7 model car, which he nicknamed Rocinante. This comes from the Spanish novel Don Quixote, which follows a 16th-century man of the same name. This man was obsessed with the stories of literary chivalry, reading them all day and night, which sometimes made him violent because of his resulting insanity. He's also super delusional because of that and thinks all those stories of fantasy he reads are true. He decides he wants to become a knight-errant, basically a knight who travels for adventures and may participate in things like duels or something. He chooses an old and sickly horse to ride, which he names Rocinante. Most of the story is about how insanely delusional Don Quixote is thanks to his obsession with the fictional tales of chivalry. I don't want to waste too much time on this whole story, but to show you the extent of this, there was one time where he is riding through a field and comes across a windmill farm. He then charges at the windmills, believing them to be giants. The windmills then proceed to beat Quixote's ass. He basically acts like this for the whole book. This part is actually pretty iconic, and is likely what the tiny windmill on Cavalier's hat and clothing is in reference to. His hat is also a reference to a knight's helmet. And most people point to the word Cavalier in Koa as an insult to Highway Cavalier by others around him for being a jerk, but that word was originally meant for defining a loyal follower of King Charles I, and the title later became an insult based on those people being self-absorbed. So even that's a small tie-in. Back to the other stuff though. The Cavalier's car, Rocinante, is shown to be a big battered piece of junk, but he still sticks with it, just like how Don Quixote did with his old and sickly horse. This simply reflects Cavalier's stubbornness. So after suffering so many losses at the hands of the Molten Hound, Highway Cavalier befriended Reflective Mirror, and from there started to cooperate more with the others as well. As they all began to bond and get closer with each other, everyone decides that instead of focusing on keeping themselves alive, they focus on specifically helping Highway Cavalier make it to the finish line, as he seems to be the most experienced racer. But not all of them really mind being stuck in the race, although they still agree to help. It's said in the song Overdrive that the repairman and fueling agent actually love it there. That makes sense for fueling agent, who enjoys the experimentation, but we already saw that the repairman was taken out of the race for a lack of will to participate, so I assume his reason to want to stay have something to do with him being the only old character in the cast. He probably didn't want to spend the rest of his days in the waking world like that, and he wanted to take advantage of the Dreamland's time manipulation so he could continue to live doing something he liked. His repairman job may be the one thing he really enjoyed doing, and the racing was just taking him away from that. After repairman and fueling agent get mentioned in Overdrive, the song goes on about how they saw opportunities to help Highway Cavalier with his car, until apparently they get caught? Yeah, I'm still not sure what that part's about. There's also this part mentioned about Highway Cavalier having his engine break down in a moment of conflict during a race, and they jump in to help refuel his car and replace mechanical parts, implying it was specifically fueling agent and the repairman, and it doesn't seem to be referencing anything specific like most other stuff there, so that's kind of random, I guess. Anyway, now back to the main story timeline of events. So after everyone agrees to help Cavalier win, he eventually manages to pull it off. He returns to the waking world, and seeks out his friends. They all quickly begin to age and die off one by one, but not before they receive their final confirmation of their success once they finally see him. Based on this, we can assume that Cavalier's success didn't just win him his freedom, but also got rid of the Molten Hound somehow. Or else all the others would have the chance to win as well after him. There's also another line in the song coming after a line about Molten Hound which talks about finishing the race that mentions denying the reward and banishing him gone. It's not very clear how exactly winning would save Cavalier, but I think it could be that he used the Life Force's limited abilities to undo the effects. Okay, now that we've gone through all of that, we can move on to all the other stuff. First, I want to mention the whole thing about the really weird phrasing of some things related to the Great Race. The phrase "the speed beyond the shadow out of time" shows up twice in the main event, once in the official summary and also on the hanging banner at the start of the racetrack. This is in reference to the book The Shadow Out of Time by H.P. Lovecraft. To make it simple, the premise is based on this alien race who lived on Earth over 100 million years ago, that can swap bodies with other life forms from basically any place, time, or even universe. They get control of their host's body, and the person they took over has their consciousness transferred to the original alien's body. They aren't violent, and they have no malicious plan, although they usually screw up their host's lives by the time they're swapped back because they act like weirdos. All they really want to do is learn about societies of different times. This alien race is referred to as the Great Race Yith, and it's specifically Great Race Yith. Calling a group the Great Race of something isn't uncommon, but I dunno, there's something about the way that the Great Race is usually referred to with quotes that makes me feel skeptical. And I know, the Great Race was likely somewhat inspired by a real-life thing, and sometimes it's referred to as the Great Rally, but still. I dunno, maybe the writers are just messing with us, because the whole idea of the shadow out of time would work either way. Since it could reference the body swapping figuratively and the short stories focus on time to talk about the aging or something. On to the next side point, we are told in the Paperboy's description that there is some sort of secret connection between the three giants and the three courses on the race. And we can determine which track corresponds with each giant based on descriptions of reflective mirror, pumping tires, and fueling agent. All of them are more prepared for one specific track of the race, and all of them work for different companies. So if we go off of that information, then the Garden Corridor would be connected to the Pharmaceutical Corporation, Snow Mountain to the Energy Corporation, and Wintry Harbor to the Transportation Corporation. These secret connections may just be here for nothing more than trying to show us that the corporations had some hand in designing specific areas of the course. And they used that to the advantage of their own racers in hopes of getting the rewards from the broadcaster. The racing mechanic talks about the energy company taking from the ruins of Steam City and trying to control distribution. Pumping Tires also tries to discover the secrets of the tracks to uncover supposed conspiracies, so that could all support the idea, and it would make sense for the Paperboy as well going forward into our next and final event of this video, Koa 5. The city of Metropolis is built upon a gluttonous excess of entertainment and pleasure. The people are given everything they could ever want, and it seems like everything's perfect for them. Now, believe it or not, but things actually aren't what they seem to be in Metropolis. Crazy, I know, but it's true. The whole city is powered by some kind of abyssal energy, but this is much different from what we've seen before. This energy is found in all the flashy neon lights that are everywhere around the city. It appears this energy has an entrancing effect on those near it, drawing them in and making them want to indulge deeper into the pleasures of the city. But this does not fully control anyone's mind, and there are other things put in place that were created to maintain control of the people. All of the media of the city is controlled by one mysterious person in charge, who nobody seems to know much about. Even their core motives are unknown by most. But they make sure the people know very little about anything bad going on behind the scenes, or on anything bad at all happening anywhere. All their entertainment is devoid of sorrow, tragedy, pretty much anything negative, even criticism. They want the people to become used to enjoying a life with nothing but good things, so that when or if they ever do hear that something's not right, their instinctive reaction would be to ignore it and go into denial, and whatever movement might spawn around the issue will never gain any traction. The face of Metropolis, and the biggest distraction for the people, is the Eternal Aura, who is mostly just referred to as the Celebrity. She is an android musician powered by the mysterious energy who pretends to be human and furthers the plans of the one in power. The people also start to merge their bodies with machines, to forcibly become part of Metropolis, and since the people have already been molded for submission, many of them give in. The whole setting of the city is based on the 1927 silent film Metropolis. This was a very influential film and is the root for much of science fiction. It also popularized the concept of a rebellion in a dystopian society rising up against greedy industrialists, so you can thank them for that trope existing. Again, I'll try to be quick with this one. So in this story's society, Metropolis is a city powered by the poor who live in an underground city and work to power Metropolis. After the leader of a rebellion named Maria brings some of the poor workers' kids to a pleasure garden in Metropolis, Frater, the son of the city master Fredersen, becomes interested in her. Frater decides to go down into the underground city to seek her out and bears witness to a brutal incident when a machine suddenly explodes, killing many of the workers. This eventually leads to Frater joining the movement later on. There's also the inventor named Rotvong who created a lifelike android that Fredersen uses to copy Maria's likeness to infiltrate and tear down the rebellion. Rotvong, however, uses the android to tear down both the rebellion and the city itself by convincing the rebels to destroy the machines, which causes a flood. The rest isn't too important, but everything's fine in the end. And this mysterious energy we see being used in Metropolis is based on Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space, which revolves around a meteorite that crashed into a field. In the story, the meteor is a living thing that sucks the life from the plants, animals, and people near its location while also horribly deforming them, and driving some of them crazy. Based on that, we know that the purple vapor energy is a living thing, and also is taking the life from the people of Metropolis. We also know based on the makeup artist's description that people who fell for the fascination of Metropolis suffer physical deformities just like in The Color Out of Space, which they go to makeup artists to cover up, and the celebrity is based on the android that pretended to be Maria in the Metropolis film. The celebrity's two forms represent the facade and the truth and how she manipulates people, like how the android did with the rebels. Despite the fact that the plan to control the people worked for most of the time, some decided they didn't want to let the city take advantage of them. Some of these people get together, and begin their media war against the city of Metropolis in hopes of winning over the hearts of the people. We thankfully were given a sort of timeline for the story, and I'll go ahead and do my best to explain the following events using that. This all begins with the host of Pirate Radio, who I'll just call Radio for simplicity's sake. So Radio, sickened by the way everyone gave themselves up for the sake of pleasure, wandered from Metropolis and realized the whole city was under a lone isolated island. Which is why nobody gets to see the sun. He finds a nearby ship port and decides he wants to expose and spread the truth of what's really going on behind the scenes in Metropolis. He creates the radio station he calls Pirate Radio, using the pre-existing broadcasting channels from inside the ship. Word of his station began to spread around a bit, but I assume it wasn't very influential in any way. That's when he was contacted by Tabloid, another person working solo who was doing research into the same scandal going on in Metropolis. She had gathered insider information about how the Energy Corporation was secretly helping Metropolis with energy supplies. This is further explained later on to show that they were helping the city with its plan in exchange for getting to research materialization and object revitalization. Likely in reference to the physical effects the energy had on the people and how that energy took life force from them. Also, a bit of a side note, but based on the symbol used on her left eye, Tabloid may be from the Investigation Bureau. Sure, the symbol isn't the same as what we saw before, but that one was just for fear officers specifically, which isn't much like Tabloid's specific line of work. And considering she just so happens to be in an investigative field, and is the most professional one from the cast with a homemade polygraph and good interrogation skills, it would make sense. If that is true, then either she was sent in, or she knew something while working for them and went rogue. Anyways, after her exchange with Radio, the two decide to work together to stop Metropolis by using the media it so heavily relied upon. But their next move would be to find more people to get the job done, which is when they approach Paperboy, the owner of an independent newspaper called Have Fun. And yes, this is most likely the same Paperboy from the last event, which makes sense based on how he spread the word about conspiracies regarding the three giants before during the Great Race. Paperboy and Tabloid collaborate to make an expose on the secrets of the city, and this is when their plan for the media war begins. However, there's a problem. They need to make sure that absolutely everyone will see it when the time comes. And there was a new upcoming performance from the celebrity at the Ethereal Theater that would definitely do the trick. So, they sought the help of Auditorium, who could edit out and replace key parts of the footage that would be used on projectors during the performance to expose the celebrity's true nature. They also come across Neon Vanguard, who enjoys to protest against the effects of the light's desires by destroying some of them. After he decided to join too, they were ready to commence with their plan. Tabloid would stay at the theater to keep communication with the others on what's happening inside, while radio started it all off with a broadcast sent out publicly all across the city. Vanguard messes with some kind of power source or something. And Paperboy spreads his flyers around while also helping Auditorium get a key off of a guard so he can get the film roll used for the performance to alter it. When everyone does their jobs, they all meet up at the theater and watch as their footage of the celebrity's true form is finally shown to the public. And that is what truly begins their media war with Metropolis. The next timeline page is just some exposition about the celebrity that we mostly already know about, so I'll skip it. We don't see much of what happens after this point, but we know the city officials went right to fighting back using the media. And in the song tied to the event, Call of the Neon Colors, we see lines such as "Let whispers commit a crime, open minds don't try to hide." This "open minds don't try to hide" part is also associated with letting yourself see the colors of the city lights, so I'm pretty sure that they're talking about the media war and its rumors. So that likely means that their approach was to convince the people that the rebels who exposed them were close-minded and against progress. Besides that, we don't have much else. There is one more thing I need to cover though before we end this section. There's this one random character seemingly unrelated to the rest, Traffic Flag. Their description mentions how despite the fact most outside media stays out, someone decided to let rumors flow in about the Great Race. And the person in charge that I mentioned before wasn't the one that let it happen, it was some force even further behind the scenes. It's likely this other force is the Energy Corporation, maybe trying to promote the race. The man in charge might not have liked outside information getting in at all, so I'm sure this would have to be a part of their agreement. Wow, okay, it looks like that's it. I guess that leaves us with the final part of this video, that being my theories. So I've already discussed a lot of my theories about all these stories as their own individual things, but this is just about the theories on the overall story and connections. And what better place to start than with the connected storyline most commonly known, Truth and Inference. That whole thing started with the original reveal of Inference and the Koa 3 Netherwalker package, which showed a poster that had Pikmin's mask lying in the background. In combination with the package accessory based on an invitation to Pikmin's museum, many began to believe the two universes were connected. Although, I don't really have much to say about that specific theory. I mean, it might be true, but we don't have a lot to work with, so I'm just gonna assume it's not too relevant to the rest of my theory. What I want to focus on most is the connections to specific characters from T&I based on the numbered badges they wear. Those characters are Truth, Inference, DM, and White, the newest one. The simple idea of it is that each Call of Abyss story is connected to each of these characters on some thematic level. But trust me, it goes a little deeper. These connections aren't just here for no good reason. But let's go over them all first. So starting with Truth, who is supposedly connected to the first Call of Abyss story. Not much of her lore can connect so easily to the story, but one piece of her story can, the Lone Moon tale. There are some pretty easy parallels to see between the relationship of Pirate Captain and Caged Butterfly, and that of the Lone Moon Knight and the Princess. But the detail I want to focus on first is the way that the story ends for these two in both universes. In Truth and Inference, the princess jumps to her death from her tower after learning that the Lone Moon Knight had lost his position as knight because of his relationship with her. And when the knight finds her dead, he also kills himself and is found in the waters surrounding the castle. But after his death, the knight changes forms into a wandering spirit and goes around aimlessly hoping to see the princess again. And the princess herself ends up living on, thanks to the heirloom which allows her to be resurrected in the body of someone from her bloodline if they wear it. However, she feels she cannot leave the castle until she can bring back the knight so they can finally run away together at the end of the Lone Moon storyline. In Koa, the caged butterfly is thrown overboard and lives on, thanks to the sea snail, yet becomes trapped in the coral. After that, the captain eventually changes form into the golden sea monster. And we know that he just aimlessly wanders the sea looking for treasure to fill the void in his heart left by Caged Butterfly. From there, the rest of the connections are pretty easy. Koa 2 would be connected to Inference's backstory, and the origins of his rivalry and strong hatred of DM as shown through Steam Teen and Evil Eye Host. Koa 3's Netherwalker and Vile Blossom would be connected to DM's story with Bella, and the story of Whiplash and Puppeteer would be connected to the Melody's estate investigation, where Truth almost dies before getting rescued by Inference. But, let's just stop right there for a moment, because this just seems too easy and simple. I mean, yeah, of course there are connections between Call of Abyss and Truth and Inference. Everyone who's up to date on those storylines can tell you that. But that leaves one big question. Why? What's the point of having a bunch of these interconnected themes with T&I? Well, if you remember my original Three Muses theory, then you'll know that I made a very specific connection theory between the trios of main lore and T&I based on the Three Muses of memory, pondering, and music. And if you saw my most recent theory, then you'd also know that the theory was confirmed without a shadow of a doubt with the release of Time of Reunion. For the sake of time I won't get into that whole thing, but what matters here is that my theory was so specific, that the fact it was confirmed meant there was surely more to it. The devs were trying to tell us that there was something deeper, that those connections actually meant something important. And out of the big three, none of the storylines have a stronger surface-level connection than main lore and Call of Abyss. Yet that's mostly because the Call of Abyss stories were written by Orpheus himself. But then again, what if there's more to it? I'm sure you all can already tell what comes next. And trust me, this might get a lot deeper than we thought it would. Before I get into that, let me explain my overall theory about why all the storylines have these connections, so that you'll all have a basic understanding of why I make certain points. I believe these three universes are all there to tell the same story of the main lore, from three different perspectives. The main lore would of course be the one the other two revolve around, going from the perspective of the present-day Orpheus who's lost his memory. Call of Abyss would be from the general perspective of Orpheus, starting from the beginning way before his memory loss occurs, and is meant to figuratively depict his perspective of events that the present-day Orpheus is still yet to remember. Truth and Inference would be an objective view of the whole story, often jumping perspectives and places in time to give us sides of the main lore from the viewpoints of other main lore counterparts. Most especially Truth, which as we know would correspond to the little girl Alice. Each universe has its own vague mysteries and missing pieces, and we're meant to look between each universe to find answers or confirmations. Now, I'll go through all these stories again, only focusing on Call of Abyss for now. So what would Koa 1 have to do with main lore? Well, I believe it must have something to do with the theme of the lover's tragedy, as I established before, since both the Koa story and corresponding T&I story focus on that plot point. And I do think I have a specific answer for that. Although we don't know much explicitly about these two, I have a strong belief that it's all supposed to be about Dennis de Ross and his wife. In the main lore, we know that Dennis's wife had gotten cancer, but the two supposedly end up dying early after a mob of people familiar to them, likely previous workers of the manor, break into their home and separate them through death, just like we see in both the Call of Abyss and Truth and Inference counterparts. We don't know what Dennis does between those 2 points on the timeline, but what we do know is that after their deaths, one of them simply stops appearing. And the other lives on somewhat as a spirit, and takes on a newer form and appearance. That person was the wife, Miss Nightingale. And at this point it's pretty obvious that she's definitely Miss Nightingale, which is something I and many others have proven easily already. I'm beginning to believe that Dennis may have done something to try and save his wife while preparing for her inevitable death. And the story in Koa 1 would be from Orpheus's external perspective of them as his adoptive parents, and is mainly set up for the events that Koa 2 is connected to. Koa 2 is about the things young Orpheus does shortly before or during the mob's attack on the manor. We know very little about what the kids did during that time except for the fact that they were taken away by the mob. But we do get little glimpses from after the fact, like when Alice talks about how Orpheus shouldn't feel guilty for their parents' deaths, because he did everything to protect them. And apparently her survival was a part of that. I think the Iron Hats were the mob of fired workers of the manor who were replaced by Burke. And the expedition team was the de Ross family and maybe even the remaining employees of the manor like Bain and Burke. I'll skip the traitor for just a moment. Also, the abandonment and eventual reintroduction of Steam City later on through the Energy Giant is also similar to the way the manor is abandoned and later returned to by Orpheus as the Baron. And also, don't forget about those 3 corporations, they'll be really important soon. Now, since we can assume all of Koa is going in a linear timeline, I believe the relationship between Whiplash and Puppeteer, and Whiplash's protective instinct, is supposed to correspond with young Orpheus's attempted protection of Alice after the tragedy at the manor. If you don't know or remember, after the mob takes the kids, Alice ends up being blamed for the death of her parents and is labeled as being insane. There was also a letter sent from Alice to her older brother Orpheus that talks about their friendship, which is the same letter I mentioned a moment ago. Based on the context, it appears that Orpheus continued to try and protect Alice and her mental state after the tragedy she witnessed, and he fails. The two get separated, and don't see each other for a while. It seems Orpheus later tries to get her back through adoption as the Baron, but isn't allowed to based on how bad her mental state ends up getting without him. This correlates to the way Whiplash tries to protect the younger Puppeteer from the insanity in the Abyss. The way that Pickman purposefully goes for taking out the Puppeteer instead of him corresponds to how it felt to be in Orpheus's shoes as they blamed it all on Alice. However, I think the first time he loses Puppeteer isn't when they get separated in the orphanage, but rather during the tragic attack from the mob that scarred Alice. After that, they take her away, but Orpheus does get back to her not long after in the orphanage for a while and then promises to protect Alice, just like how Whiplash immediately dives in with Puppeteer into the heart of the storm to prioritize her safety. Whiplash may also have done it out of guilt for not realizing the Netherwalker's deception to target Puppeteer, which would fit with Orpheus's feelings after the tragedy. Whiplash, like young Orpheus, then suddenly realizes that people were trying to take advantage of the Puppeteer, and so he stands to defend her. And also, there's another thing I wanted to point out. Based on the way that the relationship between Pickman and Vile Blossom seems to be portrayed, I'm thinking that it's meant to be about Dennis and his wife. The way the Vile Blossom comes to terms with the erosion is reflective of Dennis's wife accepting her approaching death and deciding not to go out in fear. And Pickman taking her erosion upon himself represents Dennis trying to take her sickness away against her wishes, which might have resulted in something happening to him. This would also explain why the previous story, which we assume is about Orpheus experiencing the emotions of the tragedy, also has a sole antagonist instead of mainly focusing on the Iron Hats, who were stand-ins for the mob. This sole antagonist was also specifically someone who was supposed to be on the side of the expedition, which corresponded to the de Ross family, but he betrayed them. And after the tragedy, there is no sole person who tries to target Alice, so it would make more sense if it's Orpheus's perspective of blaming Dennis for what happens after his death based on what he did beforehand. So, I'm thinking that Dennis was going to do something to save his dying wife, but Orpheus knew that whatever it was wouldn't be right. Just like in Koa 2, I think Orpheus was on the side of holding out hope for something different, like some kind of treatment. That would fit perfectly with the fact that the dilemma of Koa 2 was about the expedition running out of fuel for the city, which isn't something that could ever be fully solved without turning to the eye. They'd have to keep on searching for other power sources until they ran out of options completely and inevitably froze to death, just like how you'd keep someone with a terminal illness on life support when you know they can't be healed, and that their end is also inevitable. With that assumption in mind, that would surely mean that Dennis was the traitor. The evil eye of Steam City must have been something literally physical and supernatural, or maybe a metaphor for some kind of research into the supernatural, that he was going to use to save his wife. But maybe if it did work, it might have brought her back as a monster unlike herself, just like how turning to the evil eye to power the city would turn everyone mad, which in both cases would defeat the purpose of it all in the first place. But just like the traitor who would rather live in madness than give in to the cold, Dennis couldn't bear to just give up and wait for his wife to die while knowing he had a solution of some kind. For the tater, his result wouldn't be real living because of the madness, and for Dennis, it wouldn't be his real wife. Just like in Koa 2 though, Orpheus couldn't fully disagree with whatever it was and still understood the inner intention of his father and sympathized with him at first, and was later put into a dilemma, maybe during the attack I guess, to decide if he wanted to let Dennis do it or not. And whatever that decision was resulted in both of the parents dying somehow, despite the fact he did everything to save them. So I assume his sympathy for his mother's eternal soul was greater than his sympathy for his father's momentary grief. But he was still guilt-ridden by his choice, and that's why Alice tried to later comfort him on the situation and worded it more like it was a decision Orpheus made rather than something he wasn't able to do in time or something like that. So based on the depiction of the Netherwalker, I believe Orpheus became angry with Dennis after seeing what his actions did to Alice. Just like how the Netherwalker abandoned Vile Blossom since she could no longer be his muse, Orpheus saw Dennis as a selfish man who would rather force his own dying wife to become a monster just to make himself feel better and avoid grief. This would fit perfectly with the themes of beauty and humanity versus corruption. I believe Koa 4 to be about Orpheus returning to the manor and setting off the early stages of his journey. The way that the Great Race forces people to go back over and over again corresponds to how Orpheus had to keep playing the game. The three corporate giants also in some way represent the three medicine bottles used on the survivors. The transportation giant of Koa 1 would be based on the Orpheus or lyre bottle that could cause people to drift into comas, because of the way Madame Coral becomes trapped in the coral, which has some similarities to what happened to Eurydice in the Orpheus myth. The Energy Corporation of Koa 2 would be the Siren Song bottle which causes hallucinations and terror, based on the evil eye from Steam City and the maddening effect it would have if it were unleashed. And the pharmaceutical giant of Koa 3 would be the Dionysus bottle that causes memory loss. In the Koa 3 cinematic, we literally see the same symbol on the door that leads to the Netherwalker. It's also written on the board from the beginning with and for directions with it, so we know for sure that it had at least some significance, and would likely not be a coincidence. The connected concept of memory refers to the fact that the pharmaceutical giant bases its research on the techniques of the puppeteer and Netherwalker, which correspond with the two most important people of Orpheus's past, which became memories he forgot. And remember, the thing keeping everyone in the race was the Molten Hound, which was a creation of the pharmaceutical giant, which could imply that it represents Orpheus struggling with his past. So I'm thinking, based on Orpheus's line about Koa 4, that the story is meant to symbolize Orpheus needing to move on from his past instead of leaning back into it if he wants to break free. And the other racers that he has to work with symbolize bits of his past he has to confront in order to learn to let them go and move on, with each failed race symbolizing his struggle to do so. Cavalier winning the race and defeating the Molten Hound symbolizes breaking free from the control of the split personality of the villain spirit. Him having to watch all his friends rapidly age to death symbolizes Orpheus after confronting that past, when he has to feel the pain he tried to avoid before and focus on the future, instead of dwelling on the pain. I don't think this is telling of an event that actually happens, since that would likely be talking about where the story of main lore would end, so I assume it's speaking more to what needs to happen. Also, I could be wrong on a few things in this part, but I have a few ideas about what the other racers specifically represent. Notice how Cavalier used to work for the transportation giant, and is the only one who has departed from working for their company during the story. And if you remember my claim from a moment ago, The transportation giant would represent the coma bottle, which is literally titled Orpheus, and the other super specific details like his ignorance and his repeating painful losses make him comparable to main lore Orpheus, on top of the fact we already know it's him. So if details like those could connect him to Orpheus, maybe the others can have connections too? Now you may be thinking that tying Orpheus to the bottle that involves his name and myth may not be super reliable, because Cavalier isn't the only racer associated with the transportation giant. There's also Pumping Tires, right? Well, guess what? I'm pretty sure he's Orpheus too. Think about it. We know that there may still be those three parts of Orpheus: the new self after the amnesia, the old self from before that helps and warns the new, and the villain spirit. The villain likely isn't one of the racers, but rather the broadcaster behind it all, so they aren't relevant to this particular topic, leaving only the past self Orpheus. And just look at everything surrounding the character of Pumping Tires, like the fact that he is said to be well prepared for the Wintry Harbor track, which may possibly be a reference to how the old Orpheus had awareness and understanding of the manor tragedy from his past, which is what Steam City and Koa 2 are about. He is also determined to uncover the secrets behind the racetrack, possibly referring to when old Orpheus originally dove back into his own past to uncover his own secrets. Also, just the way the whole story ends, with Pumping Tires being the one who takes the hound head on to secure Cavalier's victory, that just feels way too intentional to me given all the things I've just mentioned. It's like Orpheus's past finally confronting the core of his issues so that his future can move forward. And the fact that Cavalier and Pumping Tires are the only two racers who make it to the Wintry Harbor may further connect them to Orpheus, since it's combining connections with both Koa 1 and Koa 2, which are basically telling the same story about the tragedy of Orpheus's parents that is the root cause of his whole story. Now let's look at Reflective Mirror from the pharmaceutical giant, which represented the suppressed memory bottle. Based on the fact that she's in that company, along with a part from her description stating that she was a stepping stone for the company, I believe that she represents Orpheus's mother. The stepping stone part may represent the fact that she wasn't allowed to die on her own terms because Dennis didn't want her to be gone, implying an at least partly selfish intention. Also, the general mature way she carries herself seems like the kind of etiquette you'd expect from someone like Dennis's wife. Fooling agent works mainly for the energy giant, but also secretly for the pharmaceutical giant, which would correspond to the terror-inducing bottle and memory-suppressing bottle, both of which perfectly fit Orpheus's sister with my connections to Koa 2 and 3. Her playful nature is reminiscent of how she's portrayed in main lore as a child with young Orpheus, and also with the way she's presented in T and I's Truth. That necessity for tragic and fierce competition that was mentioned may too be a callback to what she's suffered. And the last one would be Repairman from the Energy Giant, representing the terror bottle. I believe could be Dennis, because one of the only stand-in events that really involves him when he was still alive was that Steam City story revolving around when he was going to try and save his wife. The themes presented in his description about losing his will and having regret don't just feel like they'd fit Dennis, but those traits are also present in the other stand-in characters for Dennis like the pirate captain and the lone moon knight. Maybe it represents his afterlife, and guilt for doing what he did to his family, although in the end, he's still there to help. Also, the way that Repairman and Fueling Agent always die in the Snow Mountain track corresponds to how Orpheus loses them after the Manor tragedy. And there's another thing I want to point out. Going off of my connections between the corporations and the specific tracks, it would mean that each track is going through each story from last to first. Maybe this represents Orpheus having to start from the most recent events of his lost memory, and work backwards to the beginning where his biggest problems lie. That would also support the same idea I mentioned about Pumping Tires and Cavalier representing past and present Orpheus coming together at the end, where the past finally confronts its core demon. Some of these can be still put up to speculation, especially Repairman because we don't know much about Dennis, but even then I'd say every racer has just enough specific details to connect them to each major character of main lore. It's well worth mentioning before moving on to Koa 5. Oh, and by the way, White from T and I would be Cavalier in Koa for obvious reasons, and would also represent Orpheus in main lore because of the use of amnesia, one's past, as well as there being two sides separated by black and white. Anyways, moving on. So I think the media war of Koa 5 is about the old Orpheus and villain spirit fighting for control over Orpheus's heart. Like the energy of Metropolis in Koa 5, the villain spirit wants to reel present Orpheus in with the mystery, and slowly reveal his past to him, specifically with Dennis, so that he'll turn back into the angry man he once was and become susceptible to the villain's control again. And the old Orpheus is trying to convince the present Orpheus to stop trying to focus on his past anger, but as stated in Time of Reunion, his power to communicate is limited because of the villain spirit, corresponding to the uphill battle for control that the crew of Koa 5 go through. This is where lines like "Don't look back" come from. And compared to the others, Koa 5 is pretty simple with its length of connections because it doesn't specifically focus on one event, rather it just describes what one of the conflicts are. Although I haven't fully read up on and studied Koa 6 yet, I'm thinking it has something to do with Orpheus being drawn deeper into the manor's mysteries and madness by the villain spirit. With all of that out of the way, it seems like I've covered everything I wanted to talk about for Call of Abyss. If there's something else I want to add or that I forgot to put into the script, then I'll make a list of them in a pinned comment. And I might make a follow-up to the whole connections theory thing with more focus on truth and inference, but I'll have to read back over those past stories since they have more things to keep track of. Plus, I've never even read the Belastane story. Besides that, I just want to thank all of you for sticking around for so long. I was not expecting to get so much support in such a short amount of time when I first revealed that this video was being made. I had no idea you guys were that into my stuff, and it kind of feels weird. Oh, and one last thing. I don't have any theories videos in the making right now, but I do have plans for another newer project. I may release another video soon talking about that, so keep an eye out. Anyways, yeah, I think that's all I have to say. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you all next time.
Time for us to leave it all behind. So dance on your skies, so curious, so light on your lights. Take this night and express devoting passions and delights. So dance on your skies, never stop until senses don't try. Never ever think until you die.
Get Wi-Fi anywhere you go.
Hold up.